Cocktail parties are nothing unusual on the broad lawns that spread beneath the wooded hills of northwestern Connecticut. But there was something unusual about this one. Passers-by might have been puzzled by the black and white balloons that festooned the yard and wondered what they meant. They might well be even more puzzled by the 24 guests, many of them in their 60s and 70s, jovially partying on the lawn like a group of long-lost friends. Like the balloons, and unlike the guests at most such occasions in the area, they too were black and white. This was a gathering of former members of a civil rights group called Concern, which was active in northwestern Connecticut for much of the 1960s. They came from as far as Georgia and Illinois to see old friends and remember their work together. The group began, as one member recalled, when a local minister, in response to prodding by his bishop, wrote a letter to the local paper inviting anyone who was doing anything about race relations, or who wanted to come to an open meeting. For its first few meetings, Concern was essentially a white discussion group with occasional black visitors. As one of the early members recalled,
"We didn't really know what to do when we got together. We were so new. I think the best thing we did was ask questions."
Yes, I do.
The whites needed to learn an awful lot.
Things began to change when African Americans, or Negroes as they were then called, began presenting the group with local instances of discrimination. A local country club was accused of refusing service at the bar, even a glass of water, to a visiting black golfer. A local bank was charged with twice refusing loans to qualified blacks. Several local barbers were reported to refuse to cut black men's hair. Cashiers at a local supermarket were alleged to hand change to whites, but throw it on the counter for blacks. Many whites frankly said they didn't believe such things really happened in their communities. Some wanted to keep the organization a discussion group. Others felt efforts should be directed toward the far greater injustices in the South. But as the group began to investigate the grievances that had been alleged, they began to discover a pattern of discrimination that was often hidden from the naked white eye. A member who visited the country club discovered that it did discriminate, and won rapid agreement that it would stop doing so. The accused banker agreed to re-examine the mortgage applications. As Concern began to acknowledge the realities of discrimination in the local communities and made attempts to challenge them, it increasingly became a genuinely interracial group, with members from the small black communities of the northwest corner and the larger one of Torrington. Concern organized civil rights marches from Torrington to Litchfield and from Salisbury to the Sharon Green. They sent delegations to Alabama to march in Selma and Montgomery. They organized college scholarships and cultural trips to Harlem for local black high school students. An annual Thanksgiving dance provided the area an unusual interracial social event. When a March of Dimes fundraiser in Norfolk planned to feature local high school students in blackface for a minstrel show, Concern asked them to shun such stereotyping of blacks. The students, including at least one local black, wanted to go on with the show, but under pressure from the National March of Dimes, decided to replace the black-faced endmen with long-haired beatniks. But perhaps the most common activity for Concern, as for many civil rights groups in Connecticut at that time, was what was known as testing.
They had groups that were going out, different areas where blacks couldn't get rents. You'd go in there for a rent and they'd say it's taken. So they had couples going out and coming back and finding out that it wasn't, that it wasn't rented and the whole bit. Jobs and people going around looking, checking in on the different factories. We had a committee, remember, going around to the different factories to find out.
Roy's and I went to factories.
Right.
Until they finally put up the sign, equal rights and opportunity in the factories.
Doris Rowley, formerly of Torrington, remembers an occasion when she started out trying to help a black family rent an apartment and ended up forcing the firing of a government official who was actually encouraging discrimination. Doris Rowley, who is white, visited an apartment for rent, looked it over, and said she would talk with her husband and let the landlady know by 9 o'clock whether she would rent it. Meanwhile, by prior arrangement, a black couple arrived just as she was leaving, looked at the apartment, and were told that Doris Rowley had first crack at it.
So the black couple came over to my house. I waited till about 5 after 9, and I called up the lady, and I said I was talking to my husband, and he doesn't like the idea of it being down on the ground level, so I said we won't be able to take it. About 10 minutes later, the black couple in my home picked up the phone and called her, and they said, "Did you hear from the other lady that was there?" And she says, Yes. And they said, well, did she take the apartment? Oh, yes, it's taken.
When Doris Rowley visited the landlady, she found her with a lawyer.
Who happens to be the OEO director for Torrington, a political appointment, getting $10,000 a year to see that there's fairness in housing. And here, he's got the law book open, and he says, you put your name down as Rogers, and you're Rowley. And he says, you can't do that. He said, I can have you arrested for falsely. And I said, I looked at him, and I don't remember what his last name was, but his first name was Sal. And I said, Sal, close up your law book and go home. Close up the law book and go home because you're giving this lady bad news. I said, you're going to make trouble for her. He said, no, I won't. No, I won't.
Doris Rowley was shocked to discover that an official whose responsibility was to prevent discrimination was encouraging it, and even threatening legal action against those who tried to challenge it. She met immediately with other concerned members who called the State Civil Rights Commission and composed letters to the newspapers and the governor.
And then I picked up the phone and I called the Democratic town chairman, who was Joe Galicchio. And I said, Joe, you got to fire Sal. He said, oh, now, Doris, what did he do? So I told him. He said, well, I'm not going to fire him. And I said, well, Joe, I want to tell you, within 24 hours, it's going to hit the press. I said, now, you want to have trouble, or do you want to get the guy's resignation? So about 4 o'clock that afternoon, this is Tuesday now, he said, would you come down to my office at 7 o'clock tonight? And Eddie here and I and Earl Long went down, and he handed me the Sal's resignation. And that's my big story. That's my big story. I mean, it was a whopper. I mean, you can't, you know, when you're out and you're pounding the hills and you're trying to nail somebody, and that guy made it so easy for me, I couldn't believe that we would get a big fish like that.
They had come a long way from the first meeting's goal of airing and sharing our opinions on the subject of race relations. Like America as a whole in that era, the members of Concern had been forced to learn more about race relations than they had ever expected.
It took a long time before we whites, felt that the blacks were really talking to us. And they probably felt that we were talking above them. You know, it was a mismatch. And finally, gradually, it came together. Obviously.
And I think a lot of the white people begin to understand, you don't say anything, you listen. That's reversing it. You know, we've always had to listen. Now, we want you to listen to what we have to say.